Well, hello, everyone. I'm David Kennedy, the former director of the Bill Lane Center for the American West at Stanford, and I want to welcome you to this occasion. We're going to wait about one more minute for our participants to gather, and then we'll formally launch in just about a minute. Well, welcome everybody. To repeat, I'm David Kennedy, the former director of the Bill Lane Center for the American West at Stanford University. And I want to welcome you all to our State of the West Symposium today, which we've entitled Tales of Two Rivers. Two rivers being the Colorado and the Rio Grande. Our first hour will be devoted to a discussion of issues in the Colorado River, and the second hour to a discussion of issues, particularly health and well-being and medical issues in the Rio Grande Valley. This is the ninth such State of the West Symposium that the Bill Lane Center has co-sponsored with the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. We are anticipating by this time next year, we will be back in-person harness and we'll be able to host our traditional meeting on campus for a full day's worth of discussion of issues. Next year, our subject will be the southern border of the United States, the US-Mexican border, and we're expecting to have a very rich discussion of a set of issues at that time, and indeed we'll touch on some of those very matters today. I urge you to submit questions if you're with us remotely through using the Q&A or question and answer function that should be at the bottom of your screen if you're using Zoom. And I should also let you know that there is a caption function that you can take advantage of if you want to see a print version of what's being said, just to augment your understanding. Our first hour today will be devoted to a discussion of issues concerning the Colorado River. And I'm very happy to be able to say that a longtime friend of the Bill Lane Center, Pat Shea, will be hosting this first hour. Pat is a graduate of Stanford, Oxford, and Harvard Law School, an impressive set of credentials. He's a lawyer practicing in Salt Lake City, does some teaching at the University of Utah, and he's a former director of the Bureau of Land Management. So he has a lifetime of history of involvement with the kinds of issues that the Colorado River presents to us to an increasingly urgent form today. So Pat, I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce your panelists, Ann Castle and David Wegner. And Pat, it's all yours.
Thank you, David, very much. I want to make my introduction very brief because we have two outstanding individuals who have more knowledge than, I think, almost anyone else on the Colorado River. I was the first in the family to go to college, and I think that explains my continuing effort to make a sustainable bridge between the academy and the applied field. And Ann and David represent really an excellent bridge building operation. Ann was the Assistant Secretary for Water and Science, and David has held positions both in the executive branch, Bureau of Reclamation, and other places in the Department of Interior. And then he worked on the Hill, on the House side. And I think the adage about sausage and it's being made applies to the legislature that David understands with some precision the formulation. And on the other hand, has seen the work of the Department of Interior but she also has been spending a great deal of time involving Native Americans and their water rights, which have been suppressed, quite frankly, since the pioneers arrived. So I think today's discussion, led by those two, will be outstanding. And I hope that people will ask questions in the Q&A. So Anne, I'll turn it over to you if I may.
Well, thank you, Pat. It's great to be here, and thanks to the Bill Lane Center for inviting us here today to talk about the Colorado River. As with all things water, we start with a map, and I'm going to talk further about how that map plays into the legal framework for how we operate the river and the kinds of strains that's causing us right now. Dave Wegner is going to talk about the specific hydrology that we're experiencing right now, and then we're going to come back together to talk about potential solutions. But starting with our map, you can see that the Colorado River Basin covers 7 states. Only a little bit of California is within the geographic boundaries of the basin. But if you look at those cross-hatched areas with the red cross-hatching, those are areas outside of the geographic boundaries that are served with Colorado River water. And so you can see the Imperial Valley and, importantly, the huge chunk of the Southern California coastal plain is receiving water from the basin. The basin is divided into upper and lower, and the dividing point is at a place called Lee's Ferry, which is just downstream on the river from Lake Powell. And that's an important point in the legal framework as well. So just some sound bites for context about the river system. It serves 40 million people in the United States and Mexico. It irrigates over 5 million acres of land and some of the really most productive and lucrative cropland in the United States. There are 30 Native American tribes in the basin, 11 national parks, and it supports a huge chunk of the US economy. These numbers are a little dated. They're from 2013, but when that analysis was done, the Colorado River supported $1.4 trillion in economic activity, and that includes a very substantial recreational industry component. So the basic math that we deal with in the river and the foundation for all of the operating rules and framework comes from the Colorado River Compact, which is 100 years old this year. It was negotiated in 1922. And you hear about this compact a lot, that the river was divided equally between the upper basin and the lower basin. And that's sort of true, but there are some caveats to that. The lower basin was given in the compact 7.5 million acre feet, plus a little more. And I should take a step back and say that the currency that we deal with in the Colorado River system is acre feet. And I'm sure you all know that an acre foot of water is the amount required to cover an acre of land to the depth of 1 foot. And normal households in the West use about 1/3 of an acre foot a year. It's a little harder to wrap your brain around the concept of 1 million acre feet, but just for context, Folsom Lake in Northern California holds just about 1 million acre feet when it's full. And the big reservoirs in the Colorado River system, Lake Powell and Lake Mead, they each hold over 25 million acre feet. So that kind of gives you some of the scale. So back to the compact, the lower basin got 7.5 million acre feet plus an additional 1. And the upper basin got 7.5 million acre feet, but with some very significant caveats to that number. And then the compact provided that if deliveries to Mexico were negotiated in the future, that obligation would be split equally between the upper basin and the lower basin. So here's what the compact actually said. There's hereby apportioned to the upper and the lower basins the exclusive use of 7.5 million acre feet. So that's the equal division part. Then the lower basin has the right to increase its use by another 1 million acre feet per year. And here's the kicker. The upper basin will not cause the flow of the river at Lee's Ferry, that pivot point between the upper and lower basins, to be depleted below 75 million acre feet over any period of 10 years. So 75 million over 10, an average of 7.5 million a year. So you can see that if there's a fixed obligation to let a certain amount of flow pass at Lee Ferry, then the upper basin is really bearing the brunt of any decrease in flows. The lower basin has the advantage of that fixed obligation. And that's where we're starting to see a lot of trouble right now. So compact is negotiated in 1922, but it had to be approved by Congress. That didn't happen until 1928, partly because the governorship in Arizona changed and the new governor wasn't so happy with the provisions that were negotiated with the compact. But eventually Congress approved the compact, and at the same time, it authorized particular volumetric allocations to each of the 3 lower basin states. And you can see the numbers here. Specific volumes in millions of acre feet to California, Arizona, and Nevada. It didn't specify that that's what the allocation was going to be, but Congress said, we're authorizing the states to come together and agree to these amounts. Sort of an unusual way to do things. So then we fast forward to 1944. The United States did reach agreement with Mexico in a treaty. It provided for 1.5 million acre feet per year to be delivered at the US border to Mexico. It provided for reductions in the event of extraordinary drought, but it didn't say what that meant. And that has been a cause of some controversy over the years. In 1948, the 4 upper basin states reached a compact among themselves, and they divvied up their share. And you can see here that they didn't do it in volumes, like the lower basin allocations. They did it in percentages. And that's because of that fixed obligation at Lee Ferry, where you don't know exactly how much is available to the upper basin states. So instead of volumes, they divvied up the percentages of the total that each of the upper basin states would get. Fast forward, we have a bunch more federal legislation, the Colorado River Storage Project Act and the River Basin Project Act. Those were federal authorizations for water projects that would be developed by the Bureau of Reclamation, and they were intended to allow the states to realize and develop their allocations of Colorado River water. Arizona versus California is a very famous US Supreme Court decision. It affirmed those numbers in the 1928 Act, the 4.4 million acre feet to California, 2.8 to Arizona. Those were affirmed in the Supreme Court's decisions. And along the way, we have more and more criteria about how the river is going to be operated. So then fast forward to this century, and we are experiencing what's been called the millennial drought. And I put drought in quotation marks because many of the climate scientists would say that drought is not the right word to use. Drought implies temporary or aberrational, and that's not what we're seeing now. We are seeing a sustained decrease in flows in the whole Colorado River system. And these are just some headlines that have been in the news lately. American Rivers declared the Colorado River the most endangered in the United States. just last week, Los Angeles Times, water shortages on the Colorado River could eventually hit California, says Arizona. And interesting science about this mega drought that we're experiencing in the 21st century is the worst in 1200 years. So that's a good segue to Dave Wegner's presentation. I'm going to stop here and let Dave take over.
Thank you, Anne. Great presentation as always. Let me do the share screen thing here. And let me do that. How about that? Does that work? Share. And let's do, now I'm stuck from beginning maybe. There we go. Okay. Is that good to go?
Good to go.
Okay. Thanks, Anne. I appreciate it. That was a great introduction to the basics of the law of the river. My name is Dave Wegner. I'm coming to you today from Washington, D.C., so I apologize ahead of time if there's any extraneous noise in the background. But usually I call Tucson, Arizona home. So I live in a big chunk of the Colorado River Basin that's feeling the brunt of the 1200-year drought that Anne just spoke to. I began my work with the Bureau of Reclamation in 1975 as a dam builder. I was hired to work on the Central Utah project to help design and build dams that were helping to control the water being moved from the Green River Basin over to the Wasatch Front and Salt Lake City. Let me see here. Let's do this. I'm not going to go over a lot of the facts on this because Anne's already done a great job of doing it, except I'm going to hit on these last 3 bullets. Right now, there are 17 trans-basin diversions that take water out of the Colorado River Basin and ship it across the basin into other areas. Salt Lake City being one example. The Front Range of the Colorado Rockies is another, and into the Albuquerque area also, and Los Angeles, which is outside the basin. There are over 60 federal, state, and private dams that control the plumbing system of the Colorado River system. And the majority of the water that does support the system and that historically has filled Lake Powell and Lake Mead comes from the upper basin. And it comes from the snowpack that we've typically and historically always received. And that's part of the problem we're seeing with climate change that we're going to speak to in just a minute here. So again, a few basic facts about the system. Both Lake Mead and Lake Powell are the anchors that really control the plumbing system and the water supply that the 7 basin states use. When full, Lake Mead is about 28 million acre feet and Lake Powell is about 27 million acre feet. And overall, the whole Colorado River system, when full, has about 60 million acre feet, 59.60 million acre feet of storage available to be used by the 7 basin states and the folks that reside within it, about 40 million people. In October 1st of 2021, there was about 22.8 million acre feet in Lake Powell, and it's estimated it will be down to 20.07 million acre feet by October 1st of this year. There's some critical elevations that we're going to be talking about during the course of this talk, and that is the elevations where specific actions are by federal and state agreement initiated in terms of reducing the amount of water that's being allocated to the individual states. Lake Mead 1075 at 1,075 feet above sea level is a really key one because it then tiered off a series of actions that needed to be taken by the lower basin states in terms of reducing some of their allocations. The big one, though, that a lot of people are now discussing is where can't we move any water anymore? On Lake Mead, it's 895 feet. On Lake Powell, it's 3,370 feet. Those numbers will become significant in a minute here. So let's talk a little bit about the hydrology and some of the challenges and facts about that. First off, the Colorado River Basin has historically experienced a lot of year-to-year hydraulic variability. That's one of the reasons that the planners and the designers and the builders back in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s decided they needed to build this reservoir system, was to help mitigate some of that large variability that they were seeing up till then. However, during the last 22-year period, and that's 2000 to 2021, the unregulated inflow to Lake Powell has hit average only 5 out of the last 22 years. And that period from 2000 to 2021 is the lowest 22-year period since the closure of Glen Canyon Dam in 1963. And the average unregulated inflow to Lake Powell is about 8.46 million acre feet, which is about 88% of normal. In 2021, the unregulated inflow to Lake Powell was 3.50 million acre feet. Here's the variability piece. It was only 32% of average. That worked fine when we had a fairly robust system and all the states weren't pulling their full allocations. In 2022, the most probable forecasted inflow today is 6.32 million acre feet. And the Bureau of Reclamation does several surveys during the course of a year. And April 1st is one of the big ones. And that's where they came up with 6.32 million acre feet predictions. And that's going to be about 66% of average. So yeah, it's better than it was in 21, but it's certainly not average. And unfortunately, and especially with the last couple of weeks when we've had hot, dry winds in the West, even that 66% of average, I fear, is going to be less. The Colorado River Basin water users, and this is about 40 million people, currently consume between 14 and 15 million acre feet of water on an annual basis. However, the 20th century average for the Colorado River flow is about 12.3 million acre feet. Doesn't take a math scientist to figure out 12.3 is less than 14 or 15 million acre feet. And Ann came up with a term several years ago that Ann I still steal and use all the time, that we're seeing a structural imbalance when the inflow does not match outflow. So yeah, it's a big issue and it's becoming more and more important as the volumes in Lake Powell and Lake Mead, those two anchor reservoirs, get drained lower and lower. So what are some of the assumptions that have led to these basin consequences? Several are really important. One was that snowpack water supply would remain relatively stable. That means we'd get snow every year and it'd be we'd have low years and high years, but it would balance out. We haven't seen that for quite a few years now, for the last 22 years specifically. We also had an assumption that evaporation and sediment are not going to be consequential to overall water supply. Well, now we're finding that 700,000 acre feet that does evaporate off Powell and Mead on an annual basis on average is a pretty big chunk of water that we do need to take into consideration. And we also need to worry that sedimentation is taking away some of the storage capacity in some of our reservoirs. Third, the 20th century expectations of water supply would stay stable. And we're seeing now that water expectations are growing. Even though the basin has done a great job of conservation and efficiency, more and more people are moving to the Southwest. And as much as some folks might like, you can't tell half of Phoenix to move back to New Jersey. It just is not going to happen. The next one is traditional bell-shaped curve. For those of hydrologists in the audience, you probably know that historically we have a fairly stable bell-shaped curve. It warms up in the spring, water runs off and then goes down on a fairly consistent basis. That traditional bell-shaped curve is now becoming much more extreme. Irrigation would pay for itself. That clearly has not quite worked out as planned. Also, science is inconvenient and can be ignored except when you need it. We've seen this over and over, and a couple of really key folks in the basin, John Fleck and Eric Kuhn, formerly of the Colorado Water District up in Grand Junction, have published a couple of books on this issue, and they proved how the science showed that the volume of water available was not what the early planners believed it to be. Lastly, dams were designed to capture and store water and make electricity. These are not like Corps of Engineer dams that are also designed to move water when it gets lower levels for flood control, et cetera. There's so limited considerations were given to the operational flexibility at low water levels. And this is particularly prescient today at Glen Canyon Dam. whereas the water continues to drop lower, it's forcing the Bureau to consider using some of their operational capacity that hasn't been tested to be able to move water at low flow. So let's talk about water year 2022. The end of water year 2021, it looked pretty good in the basin. We had a good monsoon, especially in the lower basin last year. The soil moisture content came up. La Nina, we were in the second year of a La Nina, and it was trending towards neutral. Typically, that's a good sign. December 2021, we had good early snow and people were happy. Skiers in particular were hoping for a good year. January 1st of this year, snowpack was approximately 98% in the majority of the basin, and it was even higher than that in some other areas. January and February, the snow shut off, and we moved into what some of us are calling the snow drought. So by the end of February, we were down to 78% or so of snowpack water equivalent. March, April, May, dry winds, dust storms resulted in increased sublimation or evaporation of water from that snowpack. It went up into the atmosphere and is not available for runoff this year. March inflow to Powell as a result was about 329,000 acre feet, which is about 55% of normal. The most probable runoff now for Lake Powell is estimated by the Bureau to be about 6.31 million acre feet, as we spoke to before. Runoff predictions continue to drop. And so if you've been reading the newspaper and listening to reports, you've been hearing the Bureau of Reclamation and Department of Interior are looking for ways to try to prop up or keep the levels in Lake Powell high enough to continue to generate hydroelectricity. So they're trying to hold back water in Lake Powell. And unfortunately, La Nina is now trending into for a third straight year. And this is not a good sign for the basin in particular, because La Ninas typically don't bring us heavy snowpacks in the next years. So I just want to show this graph real quickly because we've been talking about the amount of moisture in the snowpack. The scientists, especially the scientists that deal with water in the snowpack, call it the snow water equivalent. And as you can see from this, our peak occurred about April 18th, but it's far below some of the higher levels we've seen in the past. And the runoff now is dropping off very quickly. I want to show this slide just to indicate how much things can change in a relatively short period of time, in this case, 1 month. In March of 2022, the Upper Colorado region, which is the majority of our snowpack, was at 97% of normal. By April, it was down to 83%. But look at the Lower Colorado region, 91% on March 19th, but only 42% a month later. This is an indication of how much moisture can be lost and how quickly it can be lost from our snowpack. So let me just show you one example here of why that's happening. Wind in the mountains. So a lot of us in the West have been all saying, we've got higher winds than we've seen in a long, long time. What's going on? Well, when those winds come, and this is part of the climate change, then we're seeing the shift in the jet stream, they're picking up sand, silts, sediments, the soil, the topsoil, et cetera, from areas. We've been seeing it a lot this year from the Great Basin in Nevada and Utah. But historically, we've seen snow and sediments, or sediments on snow, dirt on snow, come all the way from the Gobi Desert in China. What that does, it lays down layers, and you can see it in the bottom portion of this slide here, where you see a layer of dust or dirt that's been laid down on top of it. What happens when the sun hits that dark area, it captures the sun, that heat energy so much more efficiently than reflective white snow, and it causes the evaporation to accelerate and the runoff to accelerate. So I'm just about done here. La Nina is continuing, as I mentioned. The main thing I want you to take away from this slide is that blue dagger that you see extending from the coastline of South America and Central America over to Indonesia. That's cool water, and that's typical of a La Nina situation. That is a large chunk of cold water out there on the equator that continues to drive this pattern of reducing the amount of moisture that comes into the southwestern United States. These La Nina patterns are becoming much more multi-year in nature, where traditionally you'd flip back and forth between an El Nino and a La Nina. Now we're seeing getting locked into La Ninas on a much more consistent basis. So lastly here, what are some of the ideas that we need to be talking about? And this segues to what Ann and I are going to be talking about in more detail now. We need to protect surface water rights. We need to look at water management beyond state boundaries and protect upstream users. We need to look at conjunctive surface and groundwater management, protect water quality to ensure water quantity. A lot of people don't realize that when you pollute or you can't use water because of high salt contents, et cetera, that water is not necessarily available to be used for irrigation purposes. So you're actually, if you have poor water quality, impacting water quantity. And one thing that I worked on a lot when I was on the Hill was looking at how do we expand local water portfolios through reuse, recycling, and conservation. And as a scientist, I'm going to always advocate use the science. So I think with that, thank you. Oh, this is one last thing here. I was up on Lake Powell a couple of weeks ago. The slide on the left-hand side, for me anyway, are the reservoir sediments. There's over 100 feet of sediment. That's Colorado River sediment that's been deposited on the upper end of Lake Powell over the years. That's sediment that's now poised to begin to start sloughing off and moving further into the Lake Powell Basin itself. And the picture on the right is Lake Powell and the bathtub ring that we see there. So with that, Ann, I think I'm gonna unshare my screen and let you or how, I don't know how we want to take on, Pat, or how we want to take this on, but
Well, why don't I just introduce the conversation? We wanted to talk to you about solutions, not just problems. And I'll introduce it, and then Dave and I are going to have a conversation, and Pat is going to moderate the discussion and feed us questions. So there have been a lot of efforts to address the problem that Dave laid out, the problem with decreased flows and that structural imbalance that he mentioned. Starting with the 2007 interim guidelines, this was an agreement reached among the 7 Colorado River Basin states and the Department of the Interior about how the river was going to be operated. And we're continuing to operate under those guidelines today. And they expire at the end of 2025. But layered on top of those guidelines are a whole bunch of additional agreements and more rules about how the reservoirs are going to be operated and how much water will be delivered to each of the states. So in the meantime, we've reached 2 separate agreements with the country of Mexico, in which Mexico agrees to share shortages and surplus, if we're so fortunate, but mostly shortage, with the United States. And those agreements, we call them minutes, provide for joint environmental efforts as well, and joint investments in infrastructure in the Mexican part of the Colorado River Basin. Drought contingency plans were reached in the upper basin and the lower basin in 2019. They layer on top of the 2007 guidelines to impose even more restrictions on water usage in the basin when the reservoirs are low. Just last December, the 3 lower basin states reached what they call the 500 plus plan. Again, further restrictions, further reductions in the amounts of water that will be taken by those states. And then just in the past 3 weeks, the Department of the Interior and the upper basin states are taking extraordinary action to ensure that Lake Powell levels don't go too low. But I have to tell you, with all of this attention and good faith commitments to addressing the problem, we still have an imbalance between supply and demand. We're still using more than the river can supply. So in terms of solutions, what we need to be looking at is solving that math problem. we've got a supply and demand equation, and the only thing we have control over is demand. So we have to reduce demand overall. And allocating those reductions equitably, that is the trickiest, the thorniest problem that the water managers in the basin states are facing. One way to do that is to base the annual allocations to each state on actual flows. Right now, we base them on elevations in the reservoirs, but that is only indirectly related to hydrology. If we look at the actual flows and tell people what they can take based on how much water is actually there, we'll be closer to solving that math problem. Accounting for reservoir evaporation. I saw there was a question about evaporation in the basin. The evaporation from the two big reservoirs totals more than 1 million acre feet a year. So it's as Dave said, it's a very substantial part of this equation and part of the imbalance. We need to account for use of water from the tributaries in the lower basin, and that's currently not accounted for. And we need better measurement throughout the system, and we could probably both go on for a long time about that. I think part of the solution set needs to be incentives, not just mandates. We need to have incentives for reduced usage, conservation, demand management. There's lots of different terms for that. And there needs to be funding assistance for things like large-scale recycling, large-scale conservation, turf removal, desalination. You're seeing this in various parts of the basin. The best example is probably the huge water recycling and reclamation plant that is being planned and constructed in Southern California. And that's a joint project spearheaded by the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, but participated in by both Nevada and Arizona. So I'm going to stop there. Dave, I know you've got thoughts about additional solutions, and we ought to just have a conversation.
The only thing I would add to that, Anne, is that I think we need to spend significant time working with our tribal partners in the basin. There's 30 tribes, 22 of them are in Arizona. So they have a significant part of this puzzle in terms of they hold Federal Reserve, some of them hold Federal Reserve water rights. So we need to find a way to make sure they are treated equitably in this process. And because they do control a senior water rights, they've helped historically over the last few years, help address some of the shortfalls that have occurred. So we need to make sure in the future they're taken care of. The only other thing I would add is that we don't want to forget about the environmental piece of this also, in that whatever we do, we have to work within the confines of our other suite of federal laws that exist, Endangered Species Act, Clean Water Act, et cetera, to ensure they're part of the dialogue also. And I think that can be done.
Right. If I may, there's one question for Ann from another Ann. Ann Palmer is asking, how will energy development and production in the basin affect the Colorado River?
Yeah, so I'm glad you raised power, because that is so intertwined with the hydrology in the basin. And you can look at it from a couple of different perspectives. One is these big reservoirs, all of the federal projects, pretty much up and down the basin, but particularly Lake Powell and Lake Mead, they produce a huge amount of hydropower. And that hydropower generation is really important to the Western electric grid. But because there's less water in the lakes, there's less pressure pushing that water through the hydropower generation turbines. And so less power is being produced. And I've seen figures that that say that the power production at Hoover Dam, which creates Lake Mead, is down by 25%. And production at Glen Canyon Dam, which creates Lake Powell, is down by 47%. So we're seeing a whole bunch less hydropower production. And hydropower, it takes some of the burden off of fossil fuels in the Western grid, but it's also a really important backup for intermittent energy sources like wind and solar, because those aren't constant. And having it's basically a big battery. When you have hydropower production in a reservoir, you can turn that battery on when you need it. And so it's an important component of renewable energy transition. So that's one perspective. The other perspective is looking at the amount of water required in power production. And interestingly, one trend that we're seeing in the basin is the retirement of a whole bunch of coal burning electrical plants, mostly in the upper basin, around the Four Corners area. A bunch of XL plants have closed up on the Yampa River, which is a big tributary of the Colorado in the state of Colorado. So those plants used a lot of water. They're being shut down. The amount of water that they used is now available to possibly to remain in the river and address some of this imbalance, and to address the environmental concerns that Dave mentioned.
If I may, let me, question's been raised by Charlie Chaff. What is keeping the Western states from increasing water supply by desalinating ocean water?
In a word, cost. Desalination is an extremely expensive because of the energy that's required to push those molecules of water through the membranes. Also, I think, especially as you're hearing the coastline of California, what do you do with the brine, the resulting brine, and how do you dispose of that? And I think ultimately what that generates down to is, again, the cost of that is that an acre foot of water produced via desal is 4 to 5 times more expensive than other forms of water that are available today. Now, does that mean we can't and won't move that? Absolutely not. I think inevitably we're going to move more and more towards using desal, but not as a primary source of water, but as an augment to fill in the gaps and perhaps when we need that supply available to us.
Jim Blake, a classmate of mine, is asking, how is compliance with the compact monitored? Is there a joint agency that monitors compliance, or does each state investigate the compliance of the other states?
Well, the major compliance component is how much water is passing Lee Ferry. And the Bureau of Reclamation measures that amount based on some stream gauges operated by the U.S. Geological Survey. And there are pretty detailed accounting reports maintained by the Bureau of Reclamation on the usage in the various states, and in the lower basin, the usage under each contract for water delivery that the Secretary has with users along the main stem. Having said that, there are gaps in our measurement of water use in the basin. We have estimates of evaporation, for example, but they need to be refined. There are significant disagreements about how much water the upper basin states are using. And the states themselves don't agree with the way that the Bureau of Reclamation estimates use in the upper basin. So Reclamation is the major agency to come back to the specific question that was asked, but we can do a lot better in using available science and now satellite measurements to get a way more precise handle on water use.
The only thing I would add to that, and Ann's absolutely right. I mean, historically, the states and the Bureau of Reclamation, Department of Interior kind of watched each other to make sure that everybody was consistent on accounting and where the numbers came from. But as the volumes of water have diminished, people have become much more concerned about that supply. And just as an example, there's a lot of water that has historically moved around Glen Canyon Dam because of the sandstone that it's built in, that Navajo sandstone. If you go below the dam, you'll see a bunch of springs and lines of ferns where the water is seeping through. That never was of an interest before, but just a couple of weeks ago, somebody called me and said, "Hey, do you have any measurements on how much water is moving around the dam and whose water is that?" So I think it's just as those drops of water become less and less, people are more and more concerned about what's out there and are we getting our fair share. So I think science is becoming a much more important element in terms of making sure we're getting the right measurements and that those are being reported accurately to all the players in the program.
Yeah, Christy Weick asked a complex question about water management, particularly in the upper basin. And I want to supplement that. 2018 to 2020, I taught in Pakistan and have been urging them to use groundwater or aquifers to store water to avoid the problem of evaporation. Has there been any systematic study of what layers of ground or strata would be capable of storing water as opposed to Lake Powell or Lake Mead?
I'm not aware of any such studies on the kind of scale that would be required to replace that surface water storage. I think Christy's question also went to land management, particularly in the upper basin and forest health. And that is becoming a bigger and bigger consideration in ensuring sustainable flows. You know, the whole purpose of the National Forest System was to ensure favorable conditions of water flow. But some of our forest management practices have contributed to less groundwater storage, more abrupt runoff. Wildland fire contributes to this. And some of the federal legislation that we're seeing now, including the executive order that was issued just 10 days ago or so by President Biden, are intended to get at better forest management practices to even out the flows and to utilize the natural storage that's available.
That's spot on. And, you know, I think the watershed management piece is becoming a much more important one. And I'll just point to Denver Water. They're investing a lot of money on the western slope to manage the watershed in terms of forests, trees, et cetera, to not only hold the snow that does fall and hold it longer so it doesn't run off right away, get melted off right away, but also in terms of the wildfire piece, all that sediment debris that washes off after a fire into their reservoirs takes a lot of money to clean up and to pump it if it's full of sediment and such. So that's a big part. One of in terms of the aquifers and the groundwater, I would say there's a significant amount of work that's going on in the Southwest, in the lower basin right now, in terms of storing water. In Tucson, we store a significant amount of the Central Arizona Project water underground in aquifers. And that's the subject of our discussion the next 2 days here in Washington at the National Academy of Sciences is managed aquifer recharge. And we have experts from the Bureau of Reclamation talking to us from various academic institutions and other agencies on what we can do. Lastly, the U.S. Geologic Survey has done a significant amount of evaluation of the geology in the Colorado River Basin trying to figure out where these potential storage areas might be. Not all geology is created the same. And there are some geologic areas that are good for storage, and there are some that are not good for storage. And so the USGS is going to be called upon more and more to identify where these locations may be.
And let me add just one more thing, Pat, if I could. There's a coalition of environmental groups that has recently come out with a report called 10 Strategies for Climate Resilience in the Colorado River Basin. And that report speaks to land management practices and is a good handbook, I think, for addressing these kinds of questions.
There are two questions that we're going to be approaching our time. One is about the turbine set in the water. Andrew Reed asked if they couldn't have a increased pressure as it enters the plant to offset the loss of pressure due to lower levels. Is that a cost factor, David, or?
Well, it's the 8 turbines that are at Glen Canyon Dam in particular are Francis turbines. And yeah, they can be retrofitted. The cost of doing that would be pretty substantial. I think what they're also looking at is whether they could put generators, additional generators on the river outlet tubes. That's one thing that's been around, I think, since the Reagan era. They started talking about that. Jim Watt, when he was Secretary of Interior. But the cost would be substantial, and it's the investment that would be required to do that.
And
Go ahead.
Alternative to increase hydropower production that was done at Hoover Dam over the past 10 years, where the turbines were replaced with equipment that operates more efficiently at lower head. And so that was an effort to get after exactly this problem. I don't know if there are any plans to look at that for Glen Canyon Dam. Yeah,
I know there. I was in Denver last week and talking with some of the Denver engineers, and yeah, they're looking at what the options may be, but they have not initiated any significant engineering study per se. But they are looking at, well, China has done a lot in this arena. Japan's done some work in this arena, so they're pulling together that expertise from around the world to see what options might be available.
And in the last 2 minutes, I'm going to combine two questions. Elizabeth Daugherty asked, why don't we have more focus on rainwater harvesting or gray water rescue on a commercial and industrial level as well as residential? And then John Quinn asked a question, are we looking at other parts of the world for best practices that might be adopted in the United States?
I think the gray water harvesting or recycling is one technology that we're seeing more and more adoption of as water gets more scarce and more costly to come by. So that's a mechanism that a number of municipal water providers are using to stretch the supplies that they have and continue to serve their growing populations.
Yeah, I would just add to that, the Department of Interior, Bureau of Reclamation, through the Water Smart program, the Title 16 program, we've really seen that evolve over the last 10 years in terms of water reuse and recycling. And in terms of reaching out to other folks, other expertise around the world, absolutely. There are people coming forward, and the Bureau of Reclamation folks are doing a really phenomenal job on trying to bring together best practices from other parts of the world to look what the options are.
Well,
And it's ironic, I just say, Pat, it's ironic, but a lot of other parts of the world are looking to the Colorado River Basin to see what we've done here.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank David and Ann for an excellent condensed version of Colorado River 100 years after Herbert Hoover, president of Stanford, signed the compact on November 24th, 1922. And thanks to the Lane Center and David Kennedy for the update on the state of the West, an ongoing and rapidly changing story. So David, I'd hand it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat, and thank you, David and Ann, for what, for me at least, has been a really rich tutorial on the vexed issues besetting the Colorado River basin. One last question from me, addressed to the two of you. You can check online the Lake Mead water level by the day, and I looked at it over the weekend, and as I read it, the Lake Mead water level is about 3 or 4 feet from the point where we get no more hydro generation whatsoever. Is that accurate? And if so, what can be done about it?
Lake Powell or Lake Mead?
Lake Mead.
Yeah. I don't know if that's correct. I haven't looked at this week, but
Yeah.
I'm more worried about Lake Powell than I am about Lake Mead right now.
Lake Mead is at a level where it's just about to drop below one of the tiers where more significant cuts will be required of the lower basin states. Lake Powell is the one that they're worried about in terms of hydropower generation. And we know where the turbines are. The states and interior set a target level, and Dave Wegner referred to this, of 25 feet of elevation as the target. We don't want to go below, because below that we have a risk to hydropower. Right now we're at 35.22. So we've blown through the target level, and we're on our way down. So that's the more basic concern. And that's why Interior has taken these extraordinary steps recently to try to halt that reduction in the elevation.
The
engineering concern at Powell is, as the levels continue to drop, they don't want to entrain air into the water flow, because air will lead to cavitation. And cavitation and turbines don't mix.
Does Powell or Mead give us more hydropower?
Mead. Hoover Dam.
Hoover, that's what I meant, yeah. Well, again, I thank you both very much, and encourage all of our participants to stick with us, because we're going to devote our second hour to the Rio Grande River, and we'll take a brief pause, 1 or 2 minutes, and then we'll be back with hour number 2 with our panelists discussing the lower Rio Grande in particular. So thank you all very much, especially to Pat Shea and our panelists, for a truly fascinating and deeply informative set of presentations. Thanks again. Well, hello again, everybody. For those of you who are just tuning in, I'm David Kennedy, former director of the Bill Lane Center for the American West, and this is the 9th annual State of the West Symposium that the Lane Center co-sponsors annually with the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. Today's presentation or symposium is, we have entitled it Tales of Two Rivers. River number 1 was the Colorado. We just finished a to me, deeply informative hour about the issues besetting the Colorado River Basin. We're going to turn now to the second of our two rivers of the day, which is the Rio Grande River. And let me just remind you to please, those of you who are participating virtually, you can enter questions for the panelists in the Q&A function that you'll find at the bottom. For most of you, it'll be at the bottom of your screen, might be at the top for some. And there's also captioning available for those of you who care to take advantage of it. So this panel that we're about to commence just now has been organized, I'm very gratified to say, by Dr. Phil Polikoff. Phil is a long-standing practitioner of medicine and with particular interest in medical and health policy. And I'm very proud to say that the Lane Center served as a kind of a incubator and midwife for a wonderful initiative of Phil's called A Healthier We. It has its own website. You can look it up for yourselves, called A Healthier We, which is particularly addressed to issues of health and wellness, well-being, and access to healthcare in rural areas, not least of all, of course, in the American West, which is our principal interest at the Bill Lane Center for the American West. Phil has two panelists with him today, Angelina Esperanza and Ivan Melendez. I'm going to let Phil introduce them individually. And Phil, I'm going to hand it over to you now, and please take it away for our discussion of issues in the Rio Grande Valley.
Thank you so very much, David. I'm honored to be able to create this opportunity for all of us to interact on the issue of health and healthcare. I want to thank Ann, David, and Pat for the previous session, which basically was about the quantity and quality of water. And now we're turning to the quantity and quality of health and healthcare, which is slightly different. I appreciate all the efforts that the Bill Lane Center has put forth, as well as CIPRA on this issue. So what I'd like to do is, one, applaud our two panelists who are going to join us. They're very deep in the practicalities, the policies, and the politics of health and healthcare. And two, I want to make sure that this is an opportunity for you to be as interactive as possible on a very grand and bold opportunity. Dare and do to make things better for one and all for us. So we've entitled it Envisioning a Healthier Rio Grande Valley, and we'll go through a set of slides to set up the foundation before we turn it over to Ivan and then Angelina to make their comments. So as we go through this one, as you can see, this is the Rio Grande Valley, and we'll get on to our next slide from a bit of a past to future or back to the future reflections. Without knowledge, action is useless, and knowledge with action is futile. This goes back to the 6th century. Everyone wants to change the world, but nobody wants to change ourselves. Goes back to Leo Tolstoy, a noted author, a period of time ago. And then more recently from the Mayo Clinic, Douglas Woods said, think big, start small, move fast. So there's some necessary change in the healthcare area to move into a 21st model of health, not just healthcare delivery. And we do hear from many that currently it's fragmented, inefficient, and ineffective, and it's very, very costly. So if we go back in history to Sir William Osler, he had a reflection on the next slide that said, the good physician, healthcare provider, treats the disease. The great physician, healthcare provider, treats the person. So just reflect on yourself and how you've interfaced with the issue of your own health and healthcare, how much of it has been over the sickness care model, and how much it has been into the preventive health promotion model. It's just a challenge for you to ask for yourself. So now let's turn to the next slide and we'll see a bit of history. Health was defined by the World Health Organization in 1948 as a state of complete physical, mental, social, and I might say I interplaced the word spiritual well-being and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So look back or look forward 70 years. Have we really lived up to this definition in your own personal life? from my own perspective, we have a ways to go to concentrate more on health and a little less on sick care. Not that it's not important, but I think we have to look at the issue as more holistic. On our next slide, we see that there are factors influencing health. And if you notice, the physical environment enters into that, as was stated in the previous presentation on quantity and quality of water. Medical care takes up the vast amount of the cost. The cost in the United States today is $4 trillion. 20% of the gross domestic product goes into sickness care, which makes up 11% of the factors influencing health. Individual behaviors make up a significant amount. So think of yourself. What are you doing? How much stress you're under? What are you eating? What's your nutrition? All the things that enter into your own individual or self-care perspective. Social factors, otherwise more commonly heard of as the social determinants of health or the drivers of health, is your housing, your transportation, your access to broadband, and more can go into this one. And then what did you inherit? 22%. So these all enter into the factors of influencing one's overall health status. Next slide. When we see the Rio Grande Valley, just as a point of education, most of us are going to concentrate on what's known as the lower Rio Grande Valley, but the Rio Grande goes all the way from the Gulf of Mexico all the way into New Mexico. It has a population of 3 million. More live on the Mexican side of the border than on the US side of the border. It's 88.4% Hispanic. Significant amount are below the poverty level. Adults aged 18 to 64, many don't have insurance. And the interesting point of fact is that the average age in this valley is about 29 for the people. Many still do not speak English, they're not bilingual, and high school diplomas age 25 and older is at the 30+ percentiles. When we move into more specific orientation to the Rio Grande, which we'll be addressing moving forward, we're going to look at the next slide where the 4 counties right on the bottom are Cameron County, Willacy County, Hidalgo County, and Starr County. And you can see there's a Mexican side. There are major cities in here, McAllen, Brownsville, and going up. And then you can see a metamorphosis. And there's really a lot of movement from one side of the border to the other. So it's a complex issue at many levels. And we'll let Yvonne and Angelina go into a greater depth because they are much more the here and now of this part of the country. But let's look at a few major factors as we go forward on the next slide. We see that it's a vibrant region with a young population, as I already noted. The average age is about 29 age for the average person living this. Many are slightly older. High levels of innovation, collaboration, and development in the region. A lot of energy, a lot of new development. SpaceX has just moved a major launching pad to Boca area on the Gulf Coast. The community is engaged and works to find solutions among many partners. And we'll hear that from Yvonne and Angelina on what's been done and what has to be done. There's a great deal of restructuring of higher education and continues to expand. In the healthcare arena, there's a great amount of growth in the hospitals there. On the other hand, there are those who are getting better care than others. So we have to really ramp it up. A place that values honors and has a high pride, richness of their history, where it's come from, where it's been. And it's been over the last couple of 100 years, and it's changed, and it's still changing. So we're pretty exciting to take the challenges into opportunities, or take crises to opportunities. And with that, the next slide, how are we going to get there? We can see right now in the Rio Grande Valley, and this slide is slightly time dated, that on the left side, the tuberculosis, chlamydia, cervical cancer is a little higher than it is with the rest. It's actually interesting. Hidalgo County has the highest propensity for obesity in the United States, followed by Memphis, New Orleans, and other places in the South. And there is lead poisoning. The state itself is a little different. It has higher rates of HIV/AIDS, syphilis, gonorrhea, and the like. And there is how the state and the local area interact in a collaborative, collective way moving forward. With that, let me just set quickly how the foundation for the future can be. Next slide, please. So we have to take a bottom up and a top down approach. Bottom up is what is the community in that area of the county and the country can do on their own, come together, integrate, become interdependent, and find a way to the future that is as bright as possible. Top down is how does the federal government and the state government be as responsible as possible to the needs of the community, and how do we have cross leadership in making this happen? It's challenging, it's doable, and we have to look for bright spot stories, places where we can show success. And Yvonne's going to share one story about the HUD and building a laboratory, which is a great story. Next slide, please. So look for the framework for change that will attract all of us into this space. How do we assess the problem? How do we get the leadership, and especially younger leadership, because us older folks are coming to the point where we have to pass the baton and listen to the younger folks and how to communicate best with it. Communication is a major issue. The timing for all this to take place, what are the key visions? What are our shared values? How do we have continuous quality improvement, the process? How do we keep people engaged so we have sustainability and resiliency going forward, so it's not one stop, one shop for a quick solution, but it lasts for multiple generations? And just think, what can we leave to our grandchild or our great-grandchildren? How do we look at the metrics for results? So we're monitoring this on a regular basis. And what are the outcomes to show that we've succeeded in the missions and have a passion and a purpose for what we're doing? And let me just close it out before I turn it over to Yvonne with one quote. So the next slide is, how do we envision the possible? Where do we envision? There's one slide after this, and then we're moving forward. How do we amplify the places where the people live and work, our personal health and our self-care, the population health that lives around us, looking at the rate of diabetes, the rate of obesity, cardiac disease, and on and on. How do we enhance and re-envision public health so we get more people engaged on a regular basis? We certainly learned a lot from the COVID-19 pandemic. We've learned that there are things that we can do better. We also learned that we didn't build it on a superstructure, public health, before we got into this crisis. And how do we have political will? Hopefully it's nonpartisan across the board, so all of us can have prosperity and health. And with that, one slide, and then Yvonne's going to take it over. In these times, if I is replaced with we, even illness becomes wellness. We can only work towards a healthier rural America together in a collaborative way. So it's with great pleasure I turn it over to a person I've recently met, but who I would count in my inner circle of dear friends. Yvonne.
Phil, you're very kind. I hope you can see me and hear me okay today. I'm extremely excited to be here. I'd like to take these a few minutes to tell you who we are, where we are, and where I think we can go. And of course, put the touch of health to it so we can make it pertinent to today's discussion. We've had people living in our area, by the way. It's 105 degrees today. I'm in the hospital in a private room. I just saw a Border Patrol agent with 2 immigrants coming by on their way to the room this morning. I could get on top of my roof and see a vast medical school, 11 residency programs, 5 hospitals, and I could also hear gunshot in the background, which I was informed this morning was some fighting along the cartels. So we're living a tale of 2 cities. One where we appear to be in a third world country, and some of the statistics that you're about to hear will seem to indicate that. But the other is the immediate reminder to all our listeners that we are in the United States and we're extremely Americans and we're extremely proud to be part of this amazing country. And one of the biggest surprises I had as I was interviewed from people from China and Ireland and Greece and the rest of the United States, CNN, NBC, Fox, Sky News, was that the story I was telling about our pandemic just appeared to be somewhere else and not the good old USA. Let me tell you that we've had people living in our area for 11,000 years, the Apaches, the Kickapoos, the Comanches, the Karankawas, but it wasn't until the early 1900s that we really started a localized organization of folks living here, initially with land barons, the Bensons, the King Ranch, the Magic Valley, and they chose to use Posage, the Indian name for large river. thus the Rio Grande River, the big river. And this is why our county is called, or our area is called the large river from the Indian term. Now, in the year 2022, completely different population that we started. I'd like to remind our listeners that although 85% of the people who live, my neighbors here, have a Hispanic last name, that doesn't mean they're necessarily from Mexico. Even though there are many third and fourth generation Mexicans that live here that have been U.S. Citizens for a long time, there are very few people here that are descendant from those people that General Santana on his way to the Alamo left behind. Most of the people here have been immigrating in this last century, this previous century, looking for a better way of life. We went from when I moved here in 1964 from 35,000 people. Now we have about 1.5 million people living here. So today we are a very rich, multicultural group of people that encompasses people of Anglo descent, Hispanic descent, Filipino descent, African descent, European descent, Russian descent. And so we're a conglomerate, I guess, what represents a melting pot of America. That being said, when we look at our population, there's some things that really stand out that I think bear mind when talking about health. We were at one point had the infamy of having a 5% mortality rate during the COVID pandemic, 5%. The rest of the country was less than 1%. And we looked and we said, well, of course, we have 40% of people living in poverty. We have 5 out of every family members that have kids living in poverty. You have 1 out of every 4 families living in poverty. We have the lowest access to healthcare. 40% of the people in the Rio Grande Valley, compared to 19% of the people living in Texas, compared to 9% living in the United States, have a problem accessing healthcare, underinsured or not insured. When you add to it 40% of people plus being obese, the number 1 place obesity, the number 1 place in diabetes, the number 1 place in hemodialysis per capita, the lowest level of population education. 1/3 of our population is not finished even high school. When you put that all together, it becomes a tale of social inequity, of some people getting excellent renal transplants, excellent liver transplants, and other people not even being able to address their obesity. So as we went through this dichotomy of inequities to healthcare, we all learned a lesson with this COVID experience. We learned that the number 1 factor, as you can see by the slides, was our access to healthcare. And so when you see that there are similar ethnic, educational, and financially strapped areas along the border, all the way through, why did the Rio Grande Valley differ than Corpus Christi, than Laredo, than Tijuana, all those places? And it became clear to us that the difference that we have as compared to the other places along the border is that we didn't have access to healthcare. Even our culture, if your son is a neurosurgeon, he's a lot cooler than if your son or daughter is a family physician. So even culturally, we're thought to think the more procedures, the more instrumentation, the better it was. Treating obesity, diabetes, hypertension, not only did people not have access, it just wasn't sexy. It just wasn't a line of service that was leading people to say, I'm the brightest, I'm the best, I want to take care of obesity and diabetes. On the contrary, I want to do liver transplants, I want to do kidney transplants. And where we once believed that we were thin, we were educated, we had good health care, what do I need to worry about? We learned a quick lesson, and that is your health is only as good as your neighbor's health. And if your neighbor's health is poor, guess what? You're going to share in that, not only in the financial responsibility, but just the exposure of chikungunya, of Zika, of malaria, of tuberculosis. So we're having these tropical diseases in a subtropical area because of a large influx of immigration and because of the dynamics of our weather. So we learned the lesson that we should have been placing our emphasis, our focus on those that would help the greatest, as opposed to looking for lines of service that indeed might appear to be more profitable or perhaps, as I said, more sophisticated, when in reality we ignored, I think, the average Joe on the street that just needed to lose weight and control his diabetes. We learned this lesson, we saw our numbers go down, and in this process, we learned a very big word, and that was called collaboration. Before, the hospitals would fight with each other, the doctors would compete for patients, There was no come together of the governmental agencies, the health departments, the school systems, the private industry, hospitals, the public instruments, the health department. But when this pandemic came and it impacted everything from finance to civil liberties to health, everyone came together. We were able to collaborate. We had some beautiful examples. HUD, instead of giving money for the traditional housing, they gave us money for a lab that could now take care of faster turnaround and segmenting of disease. They thought out of the box. The CDC helped us with manpower. The school districts allowed us to establish large vaccination sites, distribution of vaccines, and we were blessed and fortunate that we'd established these relationships with a vast number of nurses and healthcare in the schools themselves, that we already had the infrastructure to collaborate and get these vaccines and this teaching out there. And the hospitals became magnanimous and opened up their doors and began to vaccinate and provide help to our community. So with collaboration of governmental agencies such as the CDC, HUD, public programs like the health departments and the universities, and private enterprise, the private physicians, the hospitals, we were able to come together. And today, I am so happy to say we haven't had anyone die in 4 days. We used to have 70 people die a day. We have 20 people in the hospital where we used to have 1,200 people in the hospital. We're down to 20. So great leaps and bounds have been made by the evolution of the disease, but I think also about the collaboration that came together to think out of the box. And I believe that in the last 2.5 years that we've been looking at this, there's not a doubt in my mind that social inequities, lack of access to appropriate health care created a tale of two cities, created those that were getting the best of care through the medical schools, through the transplant programs, so those that couldn't even afford to see a doctor because we only have 2 free public clinics for 1.5 million people. Lessons learned, number 1, think out of the box, identify who is being hurt. In this case, it was everyone. And when everyone is being hurt, the motivation is there for everyone to come together and collaborate. And number 2, we need to make an educational shift, a different paradigm, to understand that our neighbor's health is just as important as our own. And then we need to establish these programs that are encompassing and that take, and I know it sounds, I don't know, it sounds kind of something you read in a book, but the reality of it is you have to incorporate the ethnic, the cultural, the financial, the educational level of the people that you serve. And I think that's how we were successful. And I will tell you that I initiated in the early 80s with the pandemic of HIV. And now years later, this pandemic that has taken 35 million people and now has become endemic. Now at the latter part of my career, we have the pandemic of COVID-19 slowly turning into an endemic. I think there's many lessons that we learned that we're happy to share with others if they'll listen to us. And just a reminder that we're just another part of this great diverse country, that although we have so many different things, we share a lot more in common than what we don't have, or our differences.
Thank you so very much, Ivan. Let's pass the baton to Angelina now. Great presentation, much appreciation. Angelina has a vast experience from the public health community. She was with the city of Houston, the 4th largest community. She's with the CDC Foundation. She's looking at health equity. So let's have her share her thoughts about what has been done and what can be done moving forward. And then we'll open it up for questions, and we're already getting questions. So Angelina?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. And thank you, Dr. Melendez, for a wonderful presentation. So good afternoon. As Phil said, my name is Angelina Esparza. I serve as the Associate Vice President for Jurisdictional Support and Health Equity for the CDC Foundation. So my intent today is really to pick up a little bit on what Dr. Melendez just mentioned, the focus and the importance of collaboration. And the CDC Foundation, I'll tell you a little bit about what we actually do. And we work through collaboration, very specifically identifying needs within communities and populations in public health and in other service areas, safety, clean water, et cetera. And we work with both private and governmental structures to make sure that we find solutions. Next slide, please. So who is the CDC Foundation? The CDC Foundation helps Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which most people are familiar with, save and improve lives by unleashing the power of collaboration between CDC, philanthropies, and private entities and individuals. Again, we protect health, safety, and security, not only in the United States, but also throughout the world. So the intent really is to understand that together, when organizations and individuals work together, the outcome is greater than any individual could actually unleash. Next slide. So here are our partners. And so we work with a variety of partners, and we're uniquely able and capable to work with these partners and resources, whether it's individuals or organizations, nonprofit, education, corporation, and businesses. Sometimes our partnerships begin at the CDC, where individual scientists might have a really great idea. They want to work with someone outside of the CDC agency. They want to work with an academic facility and or someone in a community. So they will work through the CDC Foundation as a facilitator to make that happen and to accomplish their work. And then also in either scenario, whether we're working with someone whose information that's generated through the CDC or someone in the community who wants to work with the CDC, perhaps a business who understands to better achieve their goals, they have to work with a government organization. By either mechanism, we facilitate the collaboration through open dialogue, partnership, and also cross-sector resources. The CDC and its partners help to launch new programs, expand existing programs that show promise, and also establish pilot projects. And none of this would be possible without the generous donations of individuals and private industry, as well as academia, to help support government investment. So as an example, next slide, please, of what we did, this is a workforce initiative that was launched in the CDC in 2020 when the pandemic was first taking off. We were able to place individuals within state and local health departments to help supplement in what we called surge staff, and actually now we're moving away from that term because we're really building capacity of local public health to respond to the pandemic. So most of the work that we focused on initially had to do with data, laboratory services, as well as contact tracing and case investigation. Moving forward to this year, we expanded that array of services to look more at health equity, data support, and then also some specific ideas around what communities found to be challenges, such as return to school, and so school-based health and school initiatives. Next slide. Overall, we placed 3,000 individuals within the country, and specifically within Texas, we've placed almost 200, a little under about 145, 164, over the last 2 years. So just some background on the state of Texas. It's a decentralized state, and what that means is that it doesn't have a centralized state health department. Actually, the health is run through the municipalities, so that could be county or city. So now they do coordinate and work with the state. And so the state does have responsibility in that coordination of those services. Further, the state is divided into 11 public health regions across the state. If you'll see region 11 at the very bottom tip of the state, that is where the Rio Grande Valley, Lower Rio Grande Valley that we've been talking about is located. And so in addition to providing the staff all across the country, specifically in this area, we were able to provide state public health with 11 employees, Hidalgo County Health Department with 11, and then the city of Harlingen with 2 individuals. We also did some work in Laredo, which is a little bit higher, further up on the river. Next slide, please. In addition to working with the state and local health departments, we've also worked with community-based organizations. And so with those community-based organizations, we have funded 150 of those across the country. And the intent really is to understand that community-based organizations really understand the community. They have the trust built within the community. They know where the lack and the resources are and where they're not. And they also have the ability to communicate clearly with community members. And so we have been working with many CBOs in the region, in the state, to help with, particularly in this case, to drive individuals to getting the COVID-19 vaccine. In addition, we've also participated in meetings doing assessments of the initial COVID responses. Dr. Melendez referred to that. the Rio Grande Valley was hit very hard. And while New York made a lot of headlines, I don't think you saw as much about the southern part of Texas and how devastated it was by the disease. Same as in Navajo Nation. There are some populations that we don't talk about as much, don't get as much airplay, but it doesn't mean that they weren't as deeply affected. And so I'm so glad to hear the numbers that he shared today, going from the 1,200 to the 20. That is a huge accomplishment in, you know, a little over a year. So that's hats off to all the individuals who worked on to make that happen. In addition, I think one of the reasons that is because in my experience of working within this region, it is one of the most collaborative regions I have worked in the entire nation, because I do work nationwide, this area, because they have come together, they have helped each other, they have shared resources, and they have had open communication, not only amongst the resources that are there, but also with the community. We've also identified other external external large philanthropies and nonprofits such as Made to Save, which is a grassroots initiative that's looking to service underserved populations, but also to create the infrastructure needed to bring COVID-19 vaccines to communities. We hosted a meeting between that group and also the state of Texas local and state health departments to make sure that people understood how to access those services. So that was really important. It's that bidirectional communication and also providing those resources and knowledge about how to access services is just really important. A lot of times people just need to be brought to the table to understand who needs to be included, as well as what services really are needed when. And we, of course, continue our support of the community-based organizations in their area. Next slide, please. So the impact of the CDC investment, we added a large influx of new public health staff. We've been able to create remote workers, which is new for public health in general, increase the partnerships and collaborations, particularly with community-based organizations and health departments, and really providing that technical assistance to make sure that they are communicating on a regular basis, and then disseminating COVID-19 communications and resources. Jurisdictions often express their thanks for not only the quantity of individuals that we're providing, but also the quality. So I think being able to expand the capacity of public health in the region has been very helpful. And we definitely are glad and very grateful to be able to work in partnership with the health departments. We'll continue to build capacity supporting tribal, local, and territorial jurisdictions as well. Next slide, please. So moving forward, I think some of the things that are really important that we've learned is that we need to continue to support community-informed and participatory efforts. That means having the community at the table and also centering a lot of the information and the discussion and the work moving forward with the collaboration of the community as a partner. Also working collectively, both at the local, regional, state, and federal level. We heard how the region was able to use HUD funding to provide local services for laboratory. That's very important. That being able to leverage all the resources that you do have is very helpful in regions, particularly that are under-resourced or maybe haven't optimized the resources at the time. It's really a challenge, because even if you have a region that is collaborative and that are working like the Rio Grande Valley, there are some policy changes and some policy issues that definitely maybe stand in the way to optimize the health of the individuals in that area. And then we have to strengthen the public health infrastructure and build increased capacity, and then also establish these cross-sector partnerships to sustain positive change, really with the goal of the healthier and more equitable communities. So Phil, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate both your commentary. Might we just, and Yvonne, maybe let's turn it back to you. We have a few questions. The first question is, where's Yvonne living now? So there was someone who asked, are you in McAllen? Are you in Brownsville? Where do you actually reside? But that's a simple question. More importantly is, where do you see the challenges and the opportunities in the Rio Valley to get us through where we're at now to another? And what are the metrics to show that we have some success? The metrics, and also maybe in a little bit more holistic manner, because it's not only public health, it's economic growth, it's educational growth, it's all this. So where do you see this leadership coming from in the Rio Grande Valley to take us from where we're at, including the medical school, including the hospitals, but where does the Chamber of Commerce fit into this? Where does the labor organizations fit into this? How does the border crisis evolve so we get some better sense of how we're dealing with immigration so it's treated in a more definable way? And this is, I'm trying to put this forth to the two of you in a nonpartisan way. How can we come together over the next period of time and sort of dot the I's? And one last thing before we turn it back to you is healthier rural America throughout, whether it's the Rio Grande Valley, has challenges to it. The hospital closures are unique. The economies aren't doing great. The nutrition isn't there. So that's not only concerned with the border areas, it's pretty holistic in any geographic area of the county. But let's try to focus on where we're into the Rio Grande, and please ask any other questions and we'll try to get to as many as we can over this short period of time. So Yvonne, let me turn it back to you, and then Angelina, put your thoughts into that. The bright spot
Very
story.
good, excellent. That's an excellent 9 questions there, Phil. The Rio Grande Valley is 35 miles long, and it's like Puerto Rico, right? 35 miles wide, 100 miles, or 100 miles long, 35 miles wide, 35 miles wide. So if you say Manhattan, Queens, Staten Island, it's like saying Far San Juan, Alamo, McAllen, Mission, Harlingen. We're all bunched against each other. I live in Mission, which bunches up to 3 other communities. They all have very historic names at a different time. I'd love to tell you about them. We are unique where we are today because we, out of every dark cloud, there's a silver lining. And so of this horrible pandemic that we went through, my God, did we learn so much. And we're able to harness these lessons so that we can not only identify and establish plans, but that we can monitor if we're fulfilling these plans. Unfortunately, human beings, those of us who have survived, will always default to gratitude. I am so grateful I only got it twice. I'm so grateful at least I got the Moderna. So unfortunately, if we were not able to forget quickly, we would never survive. We'd be living in the cave and having a good time. I want to make sure that we do not let people forget what it was like to intubate your 6th grade school teacher, what it was like to walk into freezers with 70 people, of which 10 of them were your patients, everyone nude, everyone purple, everyone obese, everyone on top of each other. We do not want to forget that you had to die before that bed became available. In other words, no one was going anywhere. We were coding people in ambulance bays. We were losing doctors. We were dealing with our own anger of people not following basic hygiene of face masks. Here we were dousing showers before we walked into our house with all sorts of stuff just because we were so frightened. We must not forget these days, and we must not forget them because our nature to be jovial, our nature to be loving. We have to come back and use this as a motivation to say, this was our reality. And the reason that it spread through wildfire in our community is obvious. Obesity, diabetes, hypertension, lack of access to healthcare. The number one thing that's going to determine how well you do in anything in life is your baseline status of health, whether it's emotional, whether it's psychological, whether it's physical. It's where are you now when the dam breaks? Can you swim or not? And so we need to get our community in a place where in the best state of emotional, physical, nutritional, financial health, because life brings one pandemic after the other, even if it's not disease, whether it's fentanyl opioids, whether it's obesity, or whether it's an infectious disease. There's still pandemics, and they still impact us all. So what did we learn? We learned we had the wrong priorities. We learned that we need to be much less selfish about where we are, and then go to where we need to be as a community, as one. And when we learn that, then we can move forward. So how do we measure that? Okay, let's trend and let's look to see the only people that can really make a palpable, immediate, tangible are the policy voters. our politicians.
One quick question,
Yes, sir.
Yvonne, before we
Yes,
let
sir.
Anthony express, where do you see Title 42 fitting into this issue? It's talked on both sides of the political spectrum. Should it be neutral until we have a better migration policy? How do we deal with it? Because it does impact the Rio Grande Valley significantly.
Absolutely. You know, when you take care of a mother who's been living underneath a cement bridge and for 3 days, and her 10-day-old child dies in your arms because she's been living underneath the bridge, it hits home. And so even if you see people as invaders or illegals or breaking the law, when you see the humanity of these folks, let me tell you, if you give me $10 and you drop me off in Honduras, I'm not making it to the Rio Grande Valley. These are highly motivated people. So we need to understand that they're going to come regardless of what the policies are. That being said, there's a thing called pragmatism and there's a thing called theoretical. Theoretically, Title 42, of course, we're out of no matter what anybody says. By definition, we're out of the pandemic mode. Pandemic, endemic, epidemic refers to the rate of infection in the community. Anyone in public health understands that, or the rate of disease. So we're definitely out of the pandemic. So Title 42 uses that as to keep people out because pandemic mode, infectious mode. The honest fact is, if you are purely scientific, then we're out of it and Title 42 should be lifted. However, if Title 42 is used as a mechanism by which we have a more orderly entry, we had 15% of all migrants, tens of thousands a day, 15%, 1.5, that were positive for COVID. That's not the case anymore. So whatever means that we can use until we can change and enforce the law, I think that we should have a more orderly entry, whether it is Title 42 or a different format. But if you're pure.
No, I hear you. Angelina, why don't you share your thoughts on some of these issues? And also, when you look at the border, because we've had several questions now, what's occurring on the Rio Grande, which we know goes all the way to New Mexico. We know that New Mexico also has rural health issues. We know, actually, ironically, I did a movie in San Miguel County last year in New Mexico, which is very positive. Right now, their largest wildfires there and over 200,000 acres are burned. So here we had a passion of a town coming together. Now it has another such issues. So Angelina, why don't you share on how you see more bright spot stories coming about with the, including the immigration problem, and how does the CDC going to address all this?
Well, I can't speak for on behalf of the CDC. I can say that, what we've noticed in the region is that, again, that collaboration, I think, is really, really strong. I will also say that the idea of gratitude, I think the entire country owes a debt of gratitude for Dr. Melendez and his counterparts, health professionals throughout the country, because it really has been very hard. Probably has, taken a very great toll on our healthcare system in general. So that, I think, is really important to state as well. And that's where we're really trying to make sure that those individuals get the support they need, as well as the public health professionals moving forward. I think that we don't talk about that enough, and we need to talk about it more, just in general. But I will say that. I will say again that unfortunately, there wasn't enough attention paid to the South Texas border for a very long time when they were going through some of the hardest parts of the pandemic. So I think eventually they got the resources they needed. I participated in one of the assessments that had a lot of the agencies that looked at the region, and and they were talking about coding in ambulance space. We talked to EMS. They had 10-hour waits to get in hospitals. So that access to care was really quite significant. And it hasn't, while the pandemic and we've changed to an endemic, the access to care issue is still there. So these are the persistent social issues that continue. And if they don't go away, we're just setting ourselves up for another significant impact in a region, whether it's this region, whether it's Queens or Bronx in New York, whether it is Navajo Nation, wherever we're talking about in the country. This inability from a policy perspective to address some of the social issues related to health and healthcare are really important and significant. So I think that's really, you have to bring it back to policy, bring it back to this idea of collaboration across and resourcing all resources and leveraging all our resources as possible possible, but also working collectively with community. We need to bring these untraditional, non-traditional partners to the table: education, housing, food insecurity, all these issues really impinge on individuals' health. And so without being able to pull those levers for social change, we're going to continue to see the same patterns happening over and over again. And again, just to remind everybody, this is a border part, it borders another country, and those are very leaky borders, right? They're the history, the culture, the richness of all that is very important to maintain. And so understanding that when we actually address and change and improve the health along the border, it's for the entire nation. It is not just for the border, it's not just for the state, but really impacts the entire nation and what the nation can do and how healthy it can stay if we get this right. It's not about limiting who comes in, because disease, germs know no borders. They're going to come in, right? It's about what services and what strengths and infrastructure we actually have in place to address the issues moving forward. And again, that takes partnership. It takes private, public, and individuals who really are interested in seeing the policies change to make things better.
Well, that's very, very well stated. Where do you see the next generation of leadership coming from? Because as we go along this health policy, sometimes from my perspective, it's very siloed. It's siloed between those in clinical care and those in public health. There's very little overlap. I don't see enough white coats of the physician going out in the community and playing other roles. I don't see the conversation across the parties is strong enough. I think we have a rural work shortage. This could be in the Rio Grande world and all. I have a dream that I'll share with you. I'm a dreamer, maybe a little bit out too far. I'm a believer in communities of healthier living and well-being. A strong believer in the word well-being. It's much more holistic than just illness care. So I'd like to hear, because I think as we're moving towards the closure, if you had to come up and maybe you can reflect on, or Yvonne can give, what are the 3 bullets in the best sense, points that you'd like to leave with the listeners here so we can continue the dialogue after this is over? This, as I've seen for the last 5 years, it's an ongoing, evolving process. It's not a revolutionary process, but it's evolving. More people are getting engaged. More people are listening. I can tell you on rural issues, you got to listen, build trust, and have transparency rather than just put forth the solution. So it has to be collectively. So if you had thoughts on what you would like to leave with this audience, 3 key points, that would be helpful. And then Yvonne, I will ask you the same.
Yes, go ahead, Dr. Melendez, go ahead, go first.
Okay, so, we all know the story of the tree in 9/11 Towers that was destroyed during the attack. And we all know now, a decade later, that this tree is thriving. We all know, Jane Goodall said it over and over and over, we cannot lose the first point, which is optimism. We cannot lose hope. We must remain optimistic. We must understand that as much as the virus can mutate, so can we, and we have been. And so I think that that intangible aspect of being a human being allows us to think out of the box. We can't lose hope. We have to bear on. Number 2, leadership is extremely important, because if we do not have leaders that have walked the walk, have been where the dirt hits the road, it's hard for them to understand. This past year, I ran for Congress, and I realized that there's a reason why white coats don't run for Congress. We are people of now. We are doers. We are movers. We want action. We want it now. And because there's so many complex issues involved in policymaking, it takes a very special type of white coat person to meander through the bureaucracy, as opposed to those of us that are really in the clinical setting. And then finally, I think that we want the 3rd bullet, optimism, leadership that understands with patients. And the 3rd thing I would say is empathy. Empathy. We've always felt that if we are thin and healthy and work hard and we follow the rules, we're going to have access to great health care and do well. But we forget that not everyone has the same opportunity. Not everyone had your mother, not everyone had your father, not everyone had your resilience, not everyone had your tenacity, and not everyone had your luck or the grace of whatever that mysticism is out there. And so we need to be empathetic and remind ourselves that people don't choose to live in wretched conditions. No one chooses that. It is a result of some of the choices that people make, but more often not. And so we need to work with optimism, leadership, and empathy to make sure that we have policies that set forth are in the hope of helping everyone, not just a select group of people. And those would be my thoughts.
Great. Angelina, before we close out, we'd like to hear your thoughts before we turn it over to David.
Sure. So one is that, social circumstances of the now don't necessarily dictate your future, right? So when we start thinking about what the social circumstances are for individuals, the ability to change and put in motion those things that will change an individual's path can actually improve it over time. So if we look at and to say, oh, as a population, this is, it's not to look at a population and say, oh, this poor population, because that's not what the point is here. The point is that there are social conditions and circumstances, policy circumstances that put people at increased risk for certain diseases and illness for whatever reason, right? How that stands. Some of it's individual choices, but most what we've realized over decades now of research in health equity, it is not necessarily the individual. It is everything that has led up in that individual's life across the life course, whether it's access to care or education or housing, a variety of different circumstances that we know have brought someone to the present moment doesn't mean that that's going to be the future moment. So I think that's really important. I also think that, you can't program your way out of these situations. All the level of programming that's out there, whether it's collaborations, that's all great and it's helpful, but ultimately it's going to come down to policy changes and people really understanding the needs of communities and really having the interests of communities at heart and being able to create policies that actually reflective of the needs of the community and their wants. And then finally, cross-sector collaborations. This is really important. We really need to start thinking out of the box, and everyone needs to have some skin in the game. They need to understand that the economy, the economic impact, the educational impact, and when we have all those gears working and moving in the same direction, then we'll start to see this change. And not only will start to see change start, but also amplify over time.
Well, thank you so very much, Yvonne and Angelina. I think we put the foundation for the future. I would only invite all who participated to give us your comments, to stay in touch and move forward. I applaud David's on his idea that we need an in-person stage next year to talk about the border and beyond. And I would leave my 3 words: spirit, hope, and energy, because I think you have to have a spirit of goodwill, the hope that things can move forward, and the energy, but it also has to be based on sound data and use technology as part of the solution, not the only solution. So with that, David, let me share the stage with you. And thank you so much for all of us for giving us the opportunity to express our concerns and our hope about the Rio Grande Valley.
Well, thank you, Phil, and thank you, Yvonne, Dr. Melendez, and Angelina. I have a question that in some ways anticipates what we hope to do sometime later this year or early next year, which is have an on-campus, in-person gathering to talk about issues along the U.S.-Mexican border. So this is maybe too much question to answer in the next few minutes, but I'll toss it to you anyway. And it's a 2-part question, and I understand going in, this is kind of complicated. But let's say, let's think post-pandemic. The pandemic is all behind us. And what remains as the most serious healthcare well-being issue in the Rio Grande Valley? That's the first part of the question. And the second part of the question is, how much is that? How much is the character of that issue complicated or determined by the fact that there's an international frontier that runs through the valley? In other words, if you move your counties 600 miles inland, so they're no longer border counties, but in all other characteristics, they remain the same. Would the issue look different then, or would it be the same? So what's the number one health issue, well-being issue post-pandemic, and how is that complicated, if at all, by the fact that you sit on an international frontier?
Yvonne?
I will say that if the well-being and the health of the Rio Grande Valley is a house and that you want to stabilize it and make it better, then I would say that the foundation is poverty. Poverty leads to obesity because good food is relatively expensive. Foundation leads to loose bricks. Poverty leads to obesity, which leads to diabetes, to hypertension, to nephropathology, to depression, to drug use. So I think the number one thing we need to address is poverty. I don't have the answer, but certainly that I think is underlying everything else. I think that would be great, helpful. Secondly, if we were not on the border and this population was elsewhere, I think it would come down to two things. One is a genetic predisposition. 85% of the people here share some type of genetic predisposition to obesity and diabetes and other diseases. And then the second would be that because we're no longer on the border, we're somewhere else, then the issues dealing with access to healthcare and access to work and access to labor hopefully would be improved. And so I think that it's kind of a very philosophical question. I think if we move 600 north, our lot would be different. And the only commonality I think would have would be our genetic disposition for a lot of these diseases.
Okay, thank you.
So I'll just, yeah, if I can just add something, because I do think the social, having worked in an urban center that's a little further up, right, than southern Texas, I can tell you that the social issues of poverty, education, food insecurity, nutrition, all those things continue to be an issue. So you can, have access to people working, but not necessarily have access to the housing that they need. So I think that's and chronic disease.
Yeah. Well, for me, I'll just speak for myself. This has been a real education and a reminder of just how we need to think holistically about all these health-related issues, that they are socially determined, genetically determined, economically determined, geographically determined. I mean, there's so many factors that we need to take into consideration. So I want to thank all of you for such a rich discussion and remind us all that the Bill Lane Center for the American West at Stanford and the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research will be, we hope, resuming our on-campus gathering sometime next academic year, and we will be revisiting the border, the U.S.-Mexican border, in all of its complexity. It's a special interest of us at the Bill Lane Center because the entire U.S.-Mexican border runs through 4 western states: Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. So it's clearly within our remit, and we're determined to bring to bear on it some good analytic perspectives from scholars and practitioners and people on the ground. So stay tuned, rejoin us again next year, I hope. And in the meantime, I thank you again for your participation today. And thanks for all of you who are listening in for your interest in this subject. Thanks again.
Thank you.